Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start it because I'm standing between you and the reception. Okay?
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Mary Friend. I am the Director of Gas Pipeline Safety for the state of West Virginia. And just to give you a little perspective, I've been in the industry more years than I'd like to tell you. Worked for an operator for 30 years. I worked for PHMSA for 5 years and then went and worked for the state of West Virginia. Now, you're probably wondering why somebody from West Virginia is standing up here talking about gathering lines. Well, most of you probably don't know that West Virginia, in 2021, West Virginia was 4th in natural gas production in the United States, behind only Texas, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana, and we were ahead of Oklahoma. And West Virginia has a long history of gas production. Gas production in West Virginia actually started in Virginia back in the 1830s. And a lot of the early tools and the early methods of drilling developed in West Virginia. And just your point of trivia, the first military campaign against an oil field occurred in 1863 in Burning Springs, West Virginia. So that's the trivia for the day. So gas gathering lines are kind of my passion. I've been dealing with them for a lot of years. Just kind of here to give you a picture. This is the gathering function. It kind of gives you the whole perspective of the industry. It starts out in the fields, out in the gas gathering or the oil and gas fields. The gas is then transported to possibly a processing plant or through a compressor into a transmission line, ultimately going to the distribution system. Kind of a simplified cartoon. So the Natural Gas Act of 1968 provided PHMSA with jurisdiction over pipeline facilities from downhole to the burner tip. PHMSA chose not to regulate certain portions of them. They chose not to regulate downstream of the meter. That was covered adequately by the National Fuel Gas Code. They chose not to regulate downhole until 2016 when they added the storage fields and the storage wells to their jurisdiction. And they chose not to regulate production outside of the limits of any incorporated or unincorporated city, town, or village. So they really kind of didn't even regulate gathering lines for a number of years. So in 1992, Congress gave the authority to PHMSA to regulate gas gathering and to define gas gathering and to develop regulations for these regulated gas gathering lines. Now, PHMSA worked on this for a number of years. API RP 80 was published in 2000. This was the industry standard on where to determine the start of gathering, the end of production, and how to determine gathering lines. So in 2006, PHMSA published the gas gathering line definition. It became regulations. It relied on API RP 80 to define gas gathering and establish some regulatory requirements for the newly regulated gathering lines. One of the things was to establish the start and the endpoints of gas gathering as defined in 192.8, as defined in code and in the standard. It incorporated the API RP 80 as incorporated by reference addition or standard, and it established regulated gathering by class location. So class 2, 3, and 4 became regulated. Class 1, which was less than 10 buildings per mile, remained unregulated. So what PHMSA is doing is they're looking for those areas where there was a bigger impact on public safety to make those lines regulated. They also established the types of lines based on the materials and the pressures that those lines operated at. So this is a very, very simplified picture of production and gathering. You can see the productions listed in those light black lines. Those are the wells, the circles. Unfortunately, there is no symbol in Word or PowerPoint to designate a symbol, so I just had to use a circle. So the circles are wells, the black lines are gathering lines, or production lines, and the red is the gathering line. Now, one of the problems is terminology. What do you call it? What do you call production? What do you call flow lines? Industry calls it, folks, operators call it different things. So in the simple world, gathering starts where you have a commingling of two well lines. Up until that, it's production. Then it becomes gathering. You have some states who have defined gathering starts where it goes through the meter. The state of New York defines it as within 50 feet of the wellhead. Okay? Most states rely on the API RP80. I even have a problem within the state of West Virginia that my oil and gas folks who monitor the wells call everything from the well to the meter gathering. And everything downstream of the meter is production, which is the exact opposite of what I call it. So there really is no standard for what's called gathering and production. Some unique characteristics of gathering lines is they have their highest pressure at the beginning of their life. They're attached to the wells. The wells, when they're first drilled, are at their highest pressure. And as the pressure declines from the well, the pressure in the pipelines declines. So as the pipes or the lines age, the pressure reduces, and it's not as big an issue as those transmission lines that carry the same pressure year-round or all the time. Some of the other issues with gathering lines is they were constructed, or most of them were constructed, without any regulatory oversight. There are still wells in West Virginia that are over 100 years old that are economically viable and are still producing. Okay, so that means that pipeline is 100 years old. I have seen pipelines built out of well casing. I have 5-inch lines. I have 1-inch lines. I have lines with dresser couplings, lines that are screwed together. They used whatever they could, okay? I put this picture up here because they're built without regulatory oversight. That black line is actually a production line suspended in the air, okay? Yeah, those pictures that show them in the air, a lot of them come from West Virginia. They also use materials not approved by regulations. They use composite materials. They use some of these older materials. So we have a problem with the material not being appropriate. They use practices not consistent with regulations. They need to fix something, they go down to the local hardware store and get it, which may or may not be suitable for the pressures that line operates at. It becomes an issue. Then we also have inspection and testing practices. The goal was get that line in as quick as we can and get the well producing. That's how I'm going to make my money. I don't want to spend my money building a pipeline. These were actually, a lot of them are built above ground. So in 2006, they defined two types of gathering lines. There was type A, which are metallic lines operating at a hoop stress of greater than or equal to 20% SMICE, or non-metallic lines, which are mostly plastic, it could be composite materials, operated in MAOP of greater than 125 pounds. These are the ones located in class 2, 3, or 4 locations, and these were required to have full transmission regulatory requirements. They had to follow the same rules that transmission lines did. Type B lines are metallic with an MAOP producing a hoop stress of less than 20% SMICE, or non-metallic lines operating below 125 pounds. Class 3 and 4 locations, or class 2 locations by one of 3 methods that PHMSA allowed operators to use. And they had limited regulatory requirements. Now, this kind of makes sense because there's lower pressure lines. And remember I said that as they age, the pressure goes down. And so the requirements weren't quite as stringent. But the problem was when the rule came out in 2006, conventional wells were the ones that were being drilled. There was no anticipation of the growth of the technology of horizontal wells. The shale plays such as Marcellus and Bakken and Barnett were just starting to appear. So the regulations were not written for these new high pressure, large diameter gathering lines. And the problem becomes, and that's actually a picture from West Virginia. You can see it's fairly rural. But the problem is that line goes up and over the hill, comes down and goes, I won't call it a hollow, goes across a creek bottom, okay? And that creek bottom has people living there. Then it goes back up over the next hill. Nobody's living up on the hill. You can't build the houses on the hill. Comes down the other side, goes across another creek bottom with more houses, okay? These new gathering lines are operating at pressures that exceed most of the transmission lines. Typically, these are built to about 1,440 pounds. Most transmission lines are operating at about 1,000. And so the issue becomes is, aren't those people living next to those gathering lines in those bottoms, shouldn't they have the same safety aspects as somebody living next to a transmission line that's lower pressure? And then the gathering lines, like I said, may not have been built to regulatory standards. So it becomes an issue. So some of our challenges include the industry initials, API RP80, which kind of tries to strip out a lot of the gathering. There's a term called incidental gathering, which was kind of an oversight by PHMSA. In developing the rule, this allows lines coming out of a processing plant and taking that production gas to a transmission line. They didn't pull those into the regulations. So they defined this as incidental gathering. Okay, I'm okay with some incidental gathering, but there are operators who are claiming hundreds of miles of incidental gathering to get out of the regulatory requirements. So incidental gathering is an issue. Back after the mega rule was issued, the notice of proposed rulemaking for the mega rule was issued, API RP 1182 was written. This was industry's attempt to get out of some of the regulatory requirements by writing their own standard, okay? The problem with that is it was limited to pipelines that were greater than 12 inches. And one of the problems with gathering lines is composite materials. These are things made such as fiber spar or flex steel. They're non-traditional materials. They're not accepted materials in code. And operators were afraid that when and if they became regulated, that they would no longer be able to use those materials. So composite materials were also a big issue. And that was part of the reason the 12-inch was used as a cutoff, because you can use coiled non-composite or composite materials up to 8-inch. Most of the lines above 12-inch were not composite. So the gas gathering final rule was issued last year, just a little over a year ago. It subjects all gas gathering lines, including previously unregulated lines, to PHMSA annual and incident reporting requirements. And PHMSA estimates that this covers about in excess of 425,000 miles of pipeline nationally. I actually wonder if that number's not a little low. I figure probably in the state of West Virginia, I have between 70 and 125,000 miles of gathering lines. And that's just West Virginia. That's just one state. So I think that number's a little low. The other thing that they did in this gas gathering final rule is they limited this incidental gathering term to 10 miles. Took away the ability to use it. So any operator in the future can only limit their incidental gathering to 10 and not use it for a long distance. So on the previously unregulated gas gathering lines where the operating pressure exceeds 20% SMIs in Class 1 areas are now subject to certain safety standards. And PHMSA estimates that 91,000 additional miles of pipeline will be subject to damage prevention and emergency planning requirements. Again, public safety. 20,000 miles of additional pipe will be subjected to public awareness, line markers, corrosion control requirements, and leak survey requirements. And leak survey requirements also require the repair of hazardous leaks. An additional 14,000 miles of additional pipe will be subject to MAOP requirements. It means they have to test them and establish the MAOP of the line. And then it goes on to say that all new and replaced pipeline 8 inches or greater will have to be constructed in accordance with current pipeline safety regulations. So instead of being rogue and trying to decide I can build it the way I want, it's now subject to the regulations. It added 2 new categories of pipe, Type R and Type C. The effective date of the rule was May 16th, 2022. And all lines, including these Type R lines, are going to have incident reporting after this date. Their first annual reports will be due in March of 2023. The Type C lines, and I'm going to talk about this, Type C lines need to be identified by November 16th, 2022, so sometime in the last 2 weeks they had to identify these lines. And they have to compliance with safety standards by May 16th, 2023, although there is a limited stay of enforcement compliance that PHMSA has issued for some of the gathering lines. So the 2 types of lines are Type R. I personally have never heard anybody say Type R for reporting. Okay, it's reporting only. 192.8 says that Type R lines as all other onshore gathering lines, specifically in Class 1 and 2 locations. Okay, it says Class 1 less than 8 inches in diameter, no pressure limitation. Now I'm going to tell you, I have been working with this rule for over a year. Okay? And I'm looking over my notes this morning prior to this presentation going, that statement is wrong. Okay? Because Type C lines are defined as lines 8 inches or larger that are operating above 20% SMICE. So those lines that are larger than 8 inches but operating below 20% SMICE also become Type R lines. But that's one of the problems with this rule, this regulation, is every time I read it, I see another nuance, another question. Okay, so Type R lines are these Class 1 locations, anything that's not a Type A, B, or C, okay? And then Class 2 locations outside of the definitions. Type R lines are subject to reporting requirements only. They are not regulated gathering lines under Part 192. Okay, so they only have to report their miles and incidents and provide an annual report. So this is exactly what Type R lines do. They have to provide the immediate notice of certain incidents. I think, if I remember correctly, there have been about 6 incidents on unregulated lines, on the Type R lines, since the rule went into effect. They have to do then a written incident report, they have to do an annual report, and they also have to obtain an OP ID, an operator identification number, for reporting purposes. So the other type of line PHMSA defined was a Type C line. It's an outside diameter greater than 8 inch, and any one of the following. So if it's metallic with MAOP is producing a hoop stress in excess of 20% SMICE, if the hoop stress is unknown, a metallic line with an MAOP greater than 125 pounds, non-metallic pipe with greater than 125 pounds MAOP. And the non-metallic pipe could be plastic pipe, it could be composite materials. Kind of a quick summary of what this requirement is. This is an additive requirement. So all lines over 8 inch are subject to reporting requirements. That means they have to do an annual report, they have to do incident reports. They're subject to damage prevention and emergency plans, and new or replaced pipe must meet the requirements, the design and construction requirements that exist in code. Diameters 8 to 12 inches with a PIR exception have to have what's in the first section, but they also have to have public awareness. They have to have line markers, they have to have corrosion control, and they need to have leakage surveys. And actually it should be fixed leaks as well. And then pipelines between 12 and 16 inches with a PIR exception, or all pipelines above 16 inches need to meet the plastic pipe requirements, and they must establish a maximum allowable operating pressure. I'm going to go through some of this stuff real quick. It needs to meet the reporting requirements of Part 191. It needs to have a damage prevention program, which means they need to participate in a one-call. They need to make sure that their lines are protected and not hit. They have to develop emergency plans as outlined in 192.615. And to me, this is really important. How do they respond in an emergency? I've been listening all day to these emergencies and how emergency responders respond or don't respond, what they understand about the lines. And this is where it becomes important. They need to understand these are gathering lines, and they need to have an emergency plan on what they're going to do if the line fails. Prior to now, they never had to have an emergency plan. They also have to keep records documenting the methodology that they use to determine their start and stop locations. And this is not just for type C lines, it's also for type A and B lines. They also have to meet all the design requirements. And this is not the one I corrected because I have an error. It should be the testing requirements of subpart J, not subpart K. So I will acknowledge I made a mistake there. And they have to meet those design and construction requirements and testing requirements for all new, replaced or relocated or otherwise changed pipelines. One note is existing composite materials are grandfathered. So pipelines that are built out of fiber spar or flex steel can continue to operate. And actually code allowed for special permits for operators to install them again in the future. Even though they're not authorized materials through code, operators can apply for a special permit to install those lines. All gathering lines greater than, that's the one I just had, excuse me. So if the pipeline is less than 16 inches in diameter, they also might apply for a PIR exception. So this allows operators to parse the line according to population adjacent to the pipeline. Remember I told the story about that line going up and over the hill and coming across the bottom and going back up over the hill? Well, this method allows them to parse it, so the only place they have to do some of those requirements is for where the population is adjacent to the pipeline. And that part of the line that goes up and over the hill doesn't need the same requirements because nobody lives along it. So the methods they can parse the line is method one, where there is no building for human occupancy within the PIR of the pipeline. The second one is the segment is not located in a class location that contains a building intended for human occupancy or other impacted site. So kind of doing the numbers, 24-inch pipeline operating at 1,440 pounds is kind of the split over between whether I use method one or method two. So this is a real quick kind of analogy. The diagram on the left kind of shows the PIR, and if I have an identified site and I'm moving my PIR, which is potential impact radius, down the pipeline, where I first hit that impacted site becomes regulated, and it stays regulated until the PIR no longer touches that identified site. This is just the same as used in integrity management. On the other side, I simply use a class location unit, 660 feet on either side of the pipeline. So if I have a house within 660 feet, it qualifies or does not qualify for the PIR exemption. Both of these methods use buildings suitable for human occupants. These are things such as houses, office buildings, stores, restaurants, factories, outside recreation areas. They also use the term other impacted sites. These are things such as small, well-defined areas occupied by 20 or more persons at least 5 days a week for 10 weeks out of the year. Again, the same information is used in class location. This is things such as ball fields, picnic areas, rest areas. And then they added this one, which is the definition for a moderate consequence area. It's any portion of a paved surface of a designated interstate, other freeway or expressway, or other principal arterial, and arterial is spelled wrong, with four or more lanes. The comment was made earlier about the event. Sissonville was an event in West Virginia that took out the interstate for about 12 hours because the event happened right next to the interstate. And this definition was added because of that particular event. So when we talk about pipelines now, we've talked about this PIR exemption, but pipelines All pipelines with PIR exemption and pipelines greater than 16 inches must also have a public awareness plan according to 192.616. This is public awareness, not engagement. They have to install pipeline markers. Now, I am going to tell you one of the most frustrating things in my job is trying to figure out who owns a line, because gathering lines are not required to install pipeline markers. So I'll get somebody calling in saying, hey, I've got a leak. Can you get somebody to come fix it? I have no idea who owns the line. They also have to do corrosion control. They have to do a leakage survey, and then they have to fix hazardous leaks. Pipelines 12 to 16 inches with a PIR exception or pipelines greater than 16 inches must also establish a maximum allowable operating pressure. So Type C lines are not required to have an O&M manual. We've heard discussion today when we talked about the Section 114 things, and these are the written procedures operators follow to perform maintenance activities on their pipelines. Type C lines are not required to have an O&M manual. So one guy can do it one way, the next guy can come along and do it a different way. Okay, no standardization. They're also not required to have an OQ plan. Okay, so a lot of times the issue becomes that particularly with gathering line operators, sometimes they're looking at a fairly transient workforce. They may not be qualified. They never have been trained to do some of the maintenance activities. They are not required to have an integrity management plan. They're not required to have a control room management plan. And they are exempt from certain construction and design requirements, mostly in terms of records and the type of records they have to keep. Type C lines are subject to drug and alcohol, okay, because they are a regulated line under 192. They are subject to the Part 199 and Part 40 drug and alcohol requirements. So the question becomes, where's gathering start? Okay. Well, gathering actually does start at that valve on the side of the wellhead. That's where the pipeline starts, but that's not necessarily where gathering starts. And you can see these are almost two extremes. The one on the left is probably a low pressure production well at this point. The one at the right is a higher pressure line. And you can tell just by looking at them that they're different. So API RP80 is the standard for determining what is regulated and what is not. But one of the problems with API RP80 is it does not address how horizontal wells were drilled. What we have is well pads with multiple horizontal legs from a single pad. And so the production then is commingled in a header at the pad. And those lines coming out of those pads are often 8, 10, 12 inches in diameter. So at least in my opinion, that header is the start of gathering. I have not gone through that exercise with my oil and gas folks to see who makes that decision, but that's the interpretation. Other locations are subject to operator interpretation. We basically have to go with what the operator identifies. We don't have enough personnel to do the analyses to determine, yes, this is gathering, or no, it's not. We also have operators who are unfamiliar with API RP80. They don't even acknowledge they have gathering. Hey, what do you mean gathering? I have 3 well lines. Then how do we get the word out regarding new regulations? The state of West Virginia, I sent out 1,200 letters to oil and gas well operators in the state of West Virginia, providing them information on the new gathering line regulations, providing them with resources, providing them with a method to get feedback to us or ask us questions, and not a single response. So I'm actually wondering whether or not the word has gotten out that these lines are now regulated or they have to report it. The gathering line issues are unique to state programs. States are the ones who regulate this, not the federal government. They are intrastate pipelines. And one of the problems we have is name changes. I think Blaine talked about somebody with 2 different name changes, same op ID. How about I have assets that have changed names once a year for the last 8 years? Okay, and there's not a pipeline marker to be found, not an emergency number to be found. They barely report it to us. So the name changes and trying to track these operators down is just tremendous. We have a lot of forms that we need to be using because PHMSA doesn't regulate, well, they regulate, but they don't inspect gathering lines. It's left to the states to determine how they're going to inspect and the forms they use. And my favorite story is I developed a form for the Type B lines. My group and I developed this form. 2 pages, really simple. So now in trying to implement these new Type C gathering line rules, PHMSA said, well, send me your form. So I sent them my form. They took my 2-page form and turned it into 59 pages. Okay? While I appreciate that, there's a lot of things on there that don't need to be because the Type C lines are not required to follow the full transmission requirements. So we're still struggling with the forms. And one of our biggest issues is going to be we don't know how many new operators we're getting. If you were to ask me today how much mileage is going to be added in the state of West Virginia, my response is going to be between 500 and 5,000 miles. I just don't know. But my bigger problem is not the existing operators. My problem is the operators who have never been regulated. So right now, I think the state of West Virginia, I think I have 66 operators in the state of West Virginia. I may add 10 more operators. Well, that's 10 more rounds of inspections we've got to do. That means we've got to do drug and alcohol. It means we got to do standards. It means we got to look at their public awareness plan. And that's on top of what we already do. I have no clue how many more inspectors I'm going to need. And I think all of us with gathering lines are in that problem. I believe the state of Texas, who has the largest amount of gathering lines, has estimated they need 20 additional inspectors to cover these new gathering line requirements. Okay, so that's what I was. One additional comment on this is when you get new inspectors, they cannot immediately start inspecting. You have to get them trained, and that's a 2 to 3 year process to get your inspectors trained. So the reality is PHMSA didn't create 2 classifications. They created 4. Okay, so I've got these Type R lines, I've got these C lines between 8 and 12 inches, I've got these Type C lines between 12 and 16 inches, and then I have the pipelines greater than 16. They were categorized by size and pressure, but what's going to happen is operators are parsing their lines into multiple segments. So a single 60-mile pipeline segment may have 2 or 3 areas of Type C, then they may have a PIR exemption, and then they may go to a Type A. Okay, what do I do? How do you inspect it? How do you piecemeal it? There's a lot of confusion regarding requirements, and I even admitted to you I'm still confused. I still see things I have not seen before. And then there, the maintenance cost is abandoned. The concern really is not the lower pressure lines. The concern is these higher pressure, larger diameter lines. So some of the challenges we face with Type R lines is the location of the pipelines. 100-year-old pipeline, do you know where it is? You can make a best guess. You probably don't know where it is. Okay. 100 years old, the age of the pipelines, the materials they use, their legacy construction issues. I threw this picture up, and I will please, this is not in the United States, this picture. Okay. But this is the kind of things you can find on some of these older areas. Maintenance issues and emergency response. Emergency response is huge. Type R lines don't need pipeline markers, so how do we get the stuff fixed? We also have exposed pipe on these type R lines, right-of-way issues, damage prevention. In the state of West Virginia, pipelines less than 3 inches do not need to belong to one call. And that's a state regulation, that's not a federal. And then lastly, leaks. We can't force the operators on the type R lines to fix the leaks because there's no regulatory authority to do so. And one of the biggest frustrations is getting those phone calls in that say, I have a leak on my property. Can you get it fixed? And my response is, I will see what I can do. And if I can figure out the operator, can usually give them a call or send them a note and attempt to get it fixed, but it doesn't work all the time. And when we talk about emissions, it's some of these unregulated lines that are the biggest issue. So what we need are gathering lines regulations that make sense, that protect the public, that compliance then is easy to implement and understand. Like I say, I struggle with this. And then we need a balance between safety and other issues. So with that, I'll leave you my contact information and see if there are any questions. Oh, Christy, you can't ask one.
So I'm going to play, thank you, Mary, for your presentation. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. I guess I'm curious as to how PHMSA has issued these new regulations for gathering lines without the valuable input that NAPSR members or states would provide, or is some of the things that you're sharing now a result of learning more beyond those initial discussions with the regulations?
It's a combination, but the biggest issue, and I think Max talked about it a couple times this morning, is the ex parte. And I think John talked about it too, that we're treated as a member of public. So once it goes into a rulemaking process, we are not allowed input into the regulations. And I think a lot of the problems could be solved that way. I do know that this rule was negotiated more than some other rules were. A lot of pushback by industry. So.
Mary, Glenn Archambault, Jackson County. So does any of this get buried by requirements of any kind? And does local government require any kind of a permit to excavate or grade or anything of that nature?
In terms of building lines?
Yes.
No.
No.
Because usually once the well is drilled, there's a lease between the landowner and the person drilling the well. And part of that lease allows them to put the line wherever they want to. And to the best of my knowledge, there are no rules that require the excavation.
And they don't have to show even a sketch or a crude survey or anything like that? No. So there's no way to know where they actually are?
No, and you and I probably need to chat because we are, at least the commission is specifically prohibited from working on any siting of the pipelines, but we probably need to establish within the state a permitting or a pipeline permitting group to look at these things. That it might be an interdisciplinary group. So.
Hi, Lois Epstein from Alaska. I have worked for a long time and worried quite a bit about the hazardous liquid gathering lines, the oil lines, and also the produced water lines. And I know you focused on gas today, but those also have issues, and not as much safety issues, but certainly environmental concerns. And there are lots of very big releases. I don't know if you have any insight about what might happen to regulate those, or if you have personal thoughts.
Well, the brine currently is not regulated because it's not considered a hazardous liquid. The others are, and although I regulate hazardous liquid lines in the state of West Virginia, I really don't see many releases, and I know it's an issue, but I really can't address it. Okay, end session. Thank you all.